This is the little town of Condah. It's about 330 kilometres west of Melbourne, in the Western District of Victoria. Aboriginal people have lived here for more than 30,000 years. They've lived on these volcanic plains. At Lake Condah, they made permanent houses of stones and bark. They built special fish channels, and when the lake overflowed, the fish and the eels would swim up those channels and be caught in a special net made of grass and fibre. But when the newcomers came, they challenged the Aboriginal people, the Gunditjmara people, for their land. Massacres occurred, bloodshed and violence. The newcomers won out and started to graze their cattle and sheep and to plant crops on this land. In the late 19th century, the Anglican Church set up a mission station and brought the Aboriginal people onto that station to care for them, and in their own words, to try and civilise them. That is, to make it easier for the Aboriginal people to mix in the European society. Lake Condah is now on Australia's National Heritage List, and that makes it a very unique and special place. But it's a special place for me too. My grandparents lived up the road. My dad was born here. Every Sunday for more than 20 years, we would go to this little church. You can see that it's run down now, but in those days you'd get 70 or 80 or 90 people attending church here. And after church, we would go and visit Grandma. In 1914, Condah was a very, very different place from the one that you see here today. It had 3 churches: Presbyterian, Roman Catholic and Anglican. There was the hotel, the Green Hills Hotel, and that's one of the few buildings still remaining today. There's a state school. There was a butter and cheese factory. There was even a bank, a mechanics hall, a railway station, a general store, post office and a cemetery. And there was also quite a number of houses in this little street. Each year, the Condah Pastoral and Agricultural Show was held in November. The ladies of Condah held an annual dance by invitation in the Mechanics Hall in August. There was a football club, a racing club, a trotting club and a tennis club. But there was something else happening in 1914. Something that had an extraordinary impact on this little community. What was happening here in 1914 was pretty typical of events happening in small communities all around Australia. The British Empire was at war with Germany and her allies, and therefore Australia too was at war. Recruitment drives were occurring around the country, and one politician, Mr. White, he visited Condah and warned that if we didn't end the war in 12 months, the Germans would be on our doorstep, and rather than allow my women to meet the kind of fate that the Belgian women did when Germany invaded, I would sooner shoot them at my feet. There were horse sales for the war. The Condah Red Cross Society met. My grandma was a member. She made socks and table covers and tablecloths. There were concerts. There was enthusiastic enlistment. There seemed to be a frenzy to fight for the mother country, to somehow show that Australia, a young nation, could stand tall on the world stage, as horrific as this stage was to become. Records show that some 43 men enlisted from the Condah community between 1914 and 1918. This honour board was at the St Mary's Mission Church. Look down the names. Straight away you see 5 names belonging to the Lovett family. Well, names on a board don't mean much, but if I told you that all of those men were Indigenous Australians living on the mission station and not recognised as Australian citizens, not having the rights that we enjoy as all Australian citizens today, you might ask me, why would they volunteer to go and fight in a war 17,000 kilometres from home? You might also ask me, Why would 5 brothers from the one family volunteer to go to war? The Lovetts are numbered among some 1,000 Aboriginal men who enlisted right across Australia. 90 were from Victoria. And what amazes me is that 15 were from this tiny little community. Incredibly, the Lovett men all came home safely. But some of their mission mates were not so lucky. William Egan is just another name on this honour board. He's not listed as killed in action, so I assume he was one of the lucky ones. Well, let's check his war record. He was 25 years old when he joined up. He was a labourer, and it states he was killed in action on the night of the 24th and the 25th of April 1918 at the retaking of a place called Villers-Bretonneux from the Germans. So I wonder why he's not listed as killed on this board. Did his family know he had died? So how can I find out more about the wartime experience of these men? Men like Norman Scotty McLeod, a bit of a larrikin, a larger-than-life local identity, a member of the football team, and a devoted son who wrote a moving poem to the mothers of Australia, thanking them for the love that sustained men like him in the heat of battle. William Rawlings, who was awarded the Military Medal for his bravery in raiding a trench in July 1918, and he died 2 weeks later, not knowing he had received his honour. Private Ernie Looker, a labourer who enlisted in April 1916, served with the 39th Battalion and was killed in action on the 29th of September, having already been wounded twice during the war. But how can we find out what it was like for these Condah soldiers on the battlefields? Where did they fight? Were they part of important battles? Where do those who lost their lives now lie? Did their lives make a difference? And are they remembered in those lands far away where they lost their lives? It's Anzac Day. I'm a long way from home. In fact, I'm in a little town called Villers-Bretonneux, north of Paris. On this very day, in 1918, the Australians liberated this little town, and the French have never forgotten. In 1993, the unknown soldier was transported from this place and taken to the shrine at the Australian War Memorial. He left behind lots of his mates. In fact, when you walk around this memorial, there are 11,000 names of Australians who died in France and have no known grave. On the 24th of April 1918, the Germans, in their advance towards the French city of Amiens, seized Villers-Bretonneux. That night, Australian soldiers counterattacked to the north and the south of the town and encircled it. And by the evening of the 25th of April, Anzac Day, the enemy had been driven out. The little village of Villers-Bretonneux will never forget the Australians, and it's wonderful to see amongst the 4,000 people here today, school students from Australia and school students from France. So the memory of the fallen will live on. What has the morning meant to you?
Oh, it's been very emotional for me because in school I studied for 2 years the First World War for the HSC. So just learning about this, just coming here to experience it yourself is really emotional and makes you really proud to be an Australian.
It's a touch of home, and to see like the effect that our country's had on like this area where we're living in France.
In class at the moment we're studying the wars, and they acknowledge the Australians.
Yeah.
It's like written throughout all the textbooks, but also the teachers acknowledge, everyone knows about it.
In my English class they're teaching about Australian history, like the Aboriginal history and stuff, so that just shows how much the French appreciate the contribution of Australia in the First World War.
Anzac Day at Villers-Bretonneux is the start of Australia Week in northern France. And towns like this, go all out to remember and thank the Australians for what they did 100 years ago. There are special ceremonies. The local halls are decked out in Australian colours. Murals and cut-out kangaroos are in the streets. There are concerts, decorated shop windows, and there's local hospitality at the Lake Condah bar. The schools do special projects and proudly display their work in the local community. In their classrooms, French students learn about the Australian war effort, how the Aussies fought side by side with their great-grandfathers, how they helped liberate nearby villages, and how they helped the war-ravaged locals get back on their feet. They discover for themselves why there is such a strong bond today between France and Australia. Each year, more and more Australians are travelling to places along the Western Front, associated with the Australian Imperial Force. An Australian Remembrance Trail links the sites of the most significant Australian battles during the war, from Passchendaele in Belgium down to the area of some of the AIF's last actions in France around Péronne in 1918. The little town of Bulcourt is on the trail, and the people of Bulcourt have not forgotten. The people of Bulcourt and their Australian guests are making a pilgrimage up to the hill where the Australian digger stands proudly looking over the battlefields. In May 1917, they fought for 14 days here. The casualties were very severe, some 7,000 killed and wounded. The Australians fought side by side with their British allies. There were 2 battles at Bulcourt in April and May, at which Australia suffered more than 10,000 casualties. But they managed to take 2 kilometres of trenches away from the Germans who were holding the Hindenburg Line. This is a beautiful, peaceful place now. But on the night of the 31st of May 1918, the Australian 14th Battalion were resting in barns just like this one at Allenville, northeast of Amiens. Scotty McLeod was one of the soldiers here. They were probably having a cup of tea, sharing a smoke. Perhaps some French people had given them a bottle of wine. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, a direct hit by a German bomb. The stables were completely destroyed. Under torchlight, they searched for survivors and the dead. Sadly, Scotty McLeod from Condah was one of those dead. Scotty had survived the Boer War, the Gallipoli campaign, 3 years on the Western Front, but on that night, Scotty's number was up. This is the beautiful village of Allenville, and here's the communal cemetery. And I'm coming to visit the grave of Scotty McLeod. Of the 41 Australians who were present in that barn when the German shell struck it all those years ago, 17 of those who died lie here. These are Scotty's mates. Right at the end of this line of 17, I've found Scotty's grave. And it's quite an emotional moment because Scotty's family, who live thousands and thousands of miles away and who have never had the opportunity to visit the grave of their relative, have asked me to place a stone here from the land that Scotty lived on, where he played football, where he farmed. And I think they probably chose this rock because it looks a little bit like Australia. This statue represents the Battle of Fromelles, July 1916. There were something like 5,500 killed and wounded Australians on these fields. But why do we have a statue like this? Because this was a military disaster. I'm very proud of this statue because the man here is Sergeant Simon Fraser, and he comes from the Western District of Victoria. And he was one of a number of men who went out into the field in daylight to rescue the wounded. It was a shocking sight. It really pulled at the heartstrings of those in the trenches as they looked out and they saw the dead and the wounded with their arms in the air calling out for help. This statue is also a tribute to another man from Lake Condah, from the Lake Condah Mission Station, Sergeant William Saunders. He and men like Fraser went out of the trenches and they rescued their mates. On this particular statue, you'll see the word cobber. And that's there because as they carried the wounded off the field, one of the Australians raised his arm and said, "Don't forget me cobbers." This graveyard is beside a very busy road, and I doubt whether many vehicles would stop to pay their respects to the 1,500 men who were buried here. Now, 910 of those are Australians, and they took part in a very important battle in August 1918. That was the Battle of Amiens. Now, I've come to visit the grave of one of those 910 Australians who lie peacefully here. And it's the grave of this man, Private William Rawlings. Now, Rawlings came from Lake Condah, my district back in Australia. I know he was a horsebreaker. I know for a time that he lived on the Aboriginal Mission Station. And I've also found out that he won a military medal for bravery. He won that medal in July, and 2 weeks later, he died in the Battle of Amiens. So he never knew that he'd received the medal. And his father received the medal some months later with great pride. You can see that someone's been here before me because they've put this beautiful photo here of this very, very handsome young man. What's particularly poignant, I think, is that I also discovered a letter written by his mother just after this event. She wrote to the authorities saying, and she is an Aboriginal mother, "Please treat me like other mothers. Please would you return the kit and the belongings of my darling son William. I promise I will look after these things until the day I die." And she signed herself, "Your sorrow-stricken servant." You know, the story of the 43 soldiers from Condah who came over here to fight in World War I is pretty typical of the story of the Australians at war, 1914, 1918, in France and Belgium. Some of those Condah boys were involved in the liberation of Villers-Bretonneux. Others fought in the Battle of Fromelles, the Battle of Bullecourt, the Battle of Pozières. One of our soldiers received a military medal for bringing in the wounded at Fromelles. Out of the 43, 12 were killed, 19 were wounded. Other Condah soldiers fought here in Belgium, at Ypres, and this is the Menin Gate, which is the entry to this Belgian town, which in 1914 was a prosperous market town, famous for making Belgian lace. By 1915, this was a military ghost town, and photographs of the time show the extraordinary destruction that occurred. 2 Condah men were killed here, Cecil Rundle and Dave Mulseed. Cecil survived a mere 10 days of the war. Dave Mulseed survived 12 months before he too was killed. But these men were missing in action. Their bodies were never recovered. However, this is a fitting and moving place to remember them. Their names are etched here in stone on this magnificent memorial alongside some 6,000 other Australians and 60,000 soldiers from the British Empire who have no known grave. Okay, so I'm looking for Cecil Rundle. I know he's an Australian Machine Gun Corps. There's an Aussie flag up there, that gives me a hint. 2 Condah men were killed here, Cecil Rundle and Dave Mulseed. Cecil Rundle survived a mere 10 days of the war. Dave Mulseed survived 12 months before he too was killed. But these men were missing in action. Their bodies were never recovered. However, this is a fitting and moving place to remember them. Their names are etched here in stone on this magnificent memorial alongside some 6,000 other Australians and 60,000 soldiers from the British Empire who have no known grave. Okay, so I'm looking for Cecil Rundle. I know he's an Australian Machine Gun Corps. There's an Aussie flag up there, that gives me a hint. And I'm looking for the R's and we come down. Yes, here he is. Cecil Rundle. Oh, it's great to see his name. He died only 10 days after his first taste of battle, which is terribly, terribly sad. So put these poppies here as a tribute to Cecil and thanks from the Condah community. Not far from Ypres is the Burke Cemetery extension. Some of these graves belong to Australians who died here in the winter of 1917-1918. I'm looking for the grave of Lieutenant Arthur James Trengmar, and I've found him. He lies here, but why am I looking for him? Well, a good friend of mine in Condah, in the Western District, wrote to me and asked me to place a memento beside his grave. She's never had the opportunity to come to these graves, to visit her great uncle, and it's quite a poignant story. She gathered these little mementos from his farm, and I can see there's old tiles and there's pieces of glass. She went to a lot of trouble to find these, and she put them in a lovely box to pop these down here right beside the names of his two children. His daughter's name was Wynne and his son's name was Harry, and they called him Hal. But what I find particularly sad is that his wife's parents ran the post office at Condah, and it was their job, when the messages came from the front, to deliver the telegrams to people in the district whose sons had died on the Western Front. Imagine how they felt when the telegram arrived for them. The final leg on my journey along the Australia Remembrance Trail on the Western Front brings me back to my starting point, the Australian National Memorial at Villers-Brettoneux. I'm looking for the names of two Condah boys who were killed in action and have no known grave. Private Ern Looker. Now, he was with the 39th Battalion, and I can see up here Looker EA. You know, the death of loved ones tore communities like Condah apart. Communications in those days were very, very slow, and soldiers often wrote home complaining that they'd received no letters, or that the letters came months after they were sent. Now, Ern's mother wrote a letter to the authorities asking where her son was buried. Ern's future mother-in-law wrote a similar letter. It was written from Hawthorne Cottage in Condah on November the 11th, 1918.
Dear Sir, I'm writing to you as we have had a friend fallen lately on the battlefield. He was next to being one of our own. He was engaged to my daughter for nearly 4 years, and we missed him very much from the home when he went to do his duty. We knew him from his boyhood, and we would like you very much to try and get a photo of his grave for us. The Red Cross at Melbourne has advised us to write to you for it. This was our great friend's name, Private Ernest Albert Looker, 6059 and 39th Battalion. Yours faithfully, Elizabeth Malt.
It was not until 1938, when King George VI opened this memorial to those people killed in action who have no known grave, that Ern's duty to his little community, to his country, and to the British Empire was officially recognised by the placement of his name on this extraordinary memorial here at Villers-Brettoneux in France. This memorial is a long way from the Condah Mission Station, where William Egan grew up. His name is on the mission roll of honour. It's also here at Villers-Brettoneux. He was a labourer before he joined up, and he was killed towards the end stages of the war, the 24th and the 25th of April 1918. He was missing in action, and like other mothers, his parents were concerned. His brother was concerned, But when they found out what he's done, his brother wrote this very, very moving poem. And I'd like to read just a couple of verses from it. Somewhere in Belgium, dear brother, somewhere where cannons roar. Somewhere in Belgium, you're sleeping, where brave men slept before. You showed you were never a quitter. You showed that colour was naught. You fought for the same reasons, dear Bill, as others before you have sought. Years may go by, my dear brother, but your memory will ever hold dear. In our thoughts, deeds and our actions, your presence will always be near. We will never forget you, dear brother, and your picture that hangs on our wall will always remind us, dear Bill, of the day when you answered the call. So now I know what happened to William, but it's still a mystery as to why he is not listed as killed in action on the Lake Condah Mission Honour Board. So we need to be careful not to accept everything that is recorded on memorials. But this is something the local community can now fix. They can restore the board. They can make it an accurate record of the past, a true memorial to a loved one.
Your name is on the honour board that hangs on the Mission Church wall, with Ernie, Walter and Bill, brothers who answered the call.
This is a fitting place for me to end my journey of discovery, to try and a little bit walk in the footsteps of men like Mulseed, Looker, Egan, Rawlings, and the other 30 or 40 boys from Condah who came to fight in Belgium and France during World War I. I've found out a lot about the communities, about the people who welcomed them, who offered them support, and who died alongside them. Now I think places like Pozières, Bulcour, the Menin Gate, these places now mean a lot more to me.
And I reckon that what's been really encouraging for me is that school students from Belgium, France and Australia come to grave sites like this to pay their respects and to better understand the story of World War I and its terrible impact on individuals, families and communities.
I see them working together on projects, and I reckon if the young people of these three countries continue to work together to try to discover some of the positive values that can come out of tragedy, a tragedy in which more than 10 million lives were lost, then the legacy of all of these men will live on in the best of ways.
Will your sacrifice shine a light for your people back here at home? Will the freedom's flame burn brightly now